Free North. Abraham Lincoln. He's called the greatest president we ever had. When I was about 9 years old, I showed my mother a picture of Abraham Lincoln, a history book, and she said, yeah, Abraham Lincoln was ugly. A lot of people thought so. When Abraham Lincoln was a young man, he went to a party, what today we might call a singles party, a party for young unmarried men and women. The word lass means young woman in those days. Well, anyway, he said, I went to this party and I could not get one lass to talk to me. He said, I finally cornered a lass, got her off in a corner and managed to get a few words out of her, but not one lass wanted to have anything at all to do with me. Well, when he married above his class. He married the daughter of a wealthy woman. Mary Todd Lincoln's parents were slave owners. She had been to school for 10 years, and folk, you have to understand, that 10-year education might not sound like much today, but that was really, really high up in those days. Basically the equivalent of a sophomore in high school. While Abraham Lincoln was born in a log cabin, neither his father nor mother could read nor write. His father, Thomas Lincoln, his mother, Nancy Hanks. He only went to school for a year. He borrowed every book he could get his hands on. When he married his father-in-law, Todd, helped him get started, Mr. Todd, that is. He became a lawyer, admitted to the bar, went to Congress once, and to the Illinois legislature once. All this was in the 1840s. Now, there was a poem written many years later about him. Sure, he went to Congress once, but he didn't stay. Can't expect us all to be smart as Henry Clay. He only went to Congress for 2 years, 1847 to 1849. Before that, he'd been in the Illinois legislature. But in the 1850s, he never held an office, but he gained a following with his campaigns, which we'll talk about later. Again, he believed that he symbolized that anyone could become something if he'd work, if he'd try. That's not always true, but it is in a lot of cases. Americans began to move from farms to cities. More and more Americans worked in factories. The factory workers were more productive than agriculture workers, that is, in general. Steam made the factories more productive. In other words, if you needed a source of energy, you used a steam engine. And the steam could turn wheels that otherwise had been turned by horses before. Coal provided the cheap fuel for the steam engines. If you know anything about steam engines, you have a fire that boils the water, and then the water turns to steam, and the steam moves the steam piston back and forth. Again, when I was in elementary school, I saw that demonstrated by my science teacher. He had a little bitty tiny steam engine that he got revved up pretty fast. But anyway, the problem with steam engines, they're very, very heavy for the power to get out of them. The axe, very, very commonly used. For one, the axes were not only used to cut down trees, but they were also used for plowing at one point. Just chop an axe into the ground and then plant the seed into the furrow that the axe made. But in the 1830s, a man named John Deere patented a steel plow. Now, you have to understand, people did not use iron plows at first, and steel is mostly iron, because it felt like iron destroyed the soil. Well, John Deere made a plow out of steel, and steel, of course, is less prone to rust than iron, and lighter in weight than iron, and it was strong. And it revolutionized farming. You get an ox or mule or whatever on pulling a steel plow, and you could plow up a whole lot more land than a farmer could with an axe. Now, John Deere, by the way, the name is still popular. John Deere makes more tractors than anyone else in the country. Probably not him, but the factory. The factory took on his name. But anyway, he started off making plows. Cyrus McCormick invented the reaper. Essentially what a reaper is as a horse pulls the reaper, it turns the wheels, then the wheels are geared to the cutter. The wheels turn rather slowly, but the cutter turns really fast because of the way it's geared. Some of you might know what I'm talking about, but anyway, the reaper's blades would turn fast. The reaper blade would cut the hay, and this meant that a person could do a lot more work with a reaper than he could with a scythe. The scythe was like a sickle, and it was if not back breaking, it would make your back ache if you used a scythe hours a day. My dad had a scythe, and I used it a little bit. But the old-fashioned scythe could not compete with the reapers. America, more land than they had labor. Unlike Europe, they had more labor than they had land. Europe was labor rich but land poor. America was land rich but labor poor. Squatters. The word squatter means a man who would move to a government farm and stay there for several years and never pay for it. The government would allow it. The farmers who did not own the land they sat on, but they were owned by the government let them sit there. Then usually a farmer after several years would pick up and move. By this time the only land that would be available would be farther west, so he'd go west. Speculators bought the land at a price they hoped would gain them a big profit. They'd come in and buy hundreds of acres of land and then sell it to different persons. What they didn't have, folk, that made it impossible for a lot of farmers to buy, did not have the installment loan or the 30-year mortgage, where that you pay every month for 30 years and after a while it's paid off, or maybe pay for 15 years and after a while paid off. It's just, you almost had to pay cash for your land or you didn't get it. Oh yeah, now, the American system. The American system essentially is where you use interchangeable parts. Now, if they ask Eli Whitney, who invented the cotton gin, can you make rifles for the Army and make them by the hundreds? Put out a lot of. So Eli Whitney set up a system where he said, instead of each of you men who you employ make a whole rifle, I want you over here to make just the barrels. And so one department would make barrel, another department would make the springs, another department would make the triggers, another department would make the hammers, another department would make the stocks. So each department made their own part of the rifle, and the parts then were supposedly interchangeable. That is, if your rifle broke, maybe the trigger broke because you pulled it too hard or something, you could go to a store and buy just a trigger. Rather than have a blacksmith have to make a whole new trigger for you, you could buy a trigger already made. The molds then became the molds, they tried to use the same molds to make all the triggers, the same molds to make all their hammers, and parts were interchangeable. Without the American system, folk, I don't know how we do with our automobiles, because automobiles break down fairly often, but you can find a replacement part for just about any car, and a replacement part will fit in. Now, in those days, they didn't quite have the precision, so what they do, they made their triggers slightly too big to where when you bought a trigger or replacement, you had to foul it down a little bit to make it fit. Fouling was necessary. But this led to machines would be used to make parts for other machines, and et cetera, and et cetera. The American system, interchangeable parts, replaceable parts. And it meant that Eli Whitney then could put out rifles by the hundreds, much more so. I mean, while one part was making parts for the rifles, eventually all these parts would come together and somebody would assemble them in an assembly line. And again, the rifles could be produced much, much more quickly than they could have otherwise. And people who made nothing but triggers every day would become really good at it, and people who made nothing but stocks every day would become really good at making stocks. And all the rifles looked alike and worked alike and could have interchangeable parts. The one industry, though, that transformed the country more than anything else was the railroads. The United States quickly built more railroads than all the rest of the world combined, partly because in the United States there were big distances to be covered, and the railroads became faster and faster, and eventually trains got to where they could go 50 and 60 miles an hour, and folk, again, in those days that was fast, and they could travel with that speed day and night. Most of the railroads were privately owned. Now, The Samuel Morse invented the telegraph, and for the first time mankind had instant communication from one place to another. Now the telegraph, Samuel Morse did not know how to talk on his telegraph, so all he had was just dot and dash, da-da, 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 dot it, dots and dashes. And this was the way, and you had to learn the Morse code. Now the Morse code he used was not the Morse code we use today. We have a different kind of Morse code, but nevertheless it still has his name. Now, the telegraph was really necessary to keep trains from colliding with each other. In other words, at one point there might be just one line going between two cities, and you had to make sure that when one train was going this way, another train was not going this way on the same track. Now eventually, there'd be two lines put, and the trains were told, always stay on the right. So you stay on the right, and when the other fellow comes at you, he'll be on the left. You can pass each other without colliding. Now, collisions of railroads still happens, folk. In spite of the fact we have computers, in spite of everything else we have, trains do still sometimes collide. But the invention of telegraph greatly reduced the amount of collisions. The government would give the railroads a lot of land, and of course, you know, a track only takes a narrow strip of land, so the railroads would use their narrow strip of land to put down track, and then they'd sell the land that the government had given them that they didn't use. Unfortunately, a lot of times the higher up, richer people would live on one side of the track, and your poorer people on the other side of the track. And there was a saying, he was born on the wrong side of the track, so he lives on the wrong side of the track. Women and black Americans had little chance of moving into higher paying jobs, even if they were free black Americans. The word free labor meant workers who were not slaves. And again, the northern people and the people in the west believed that free laborers produced better work than slaves. Now, folk, this is not meant to be racial. I mean, I spent 27 years at Lockheed, where we built airplanes, and I'm convinced that slave labor could not have built airplanes, but black people were employed at Lockheed in droves, and some of them employed as engineers, but they were not slaves. Again, as free people, they did higher quality work. The type of work that it takes to get an airplane to work generally cannot be done by slaves, but it can be done by free people of any race. Hopefully I made that point clear. But again, they felt like free laborers did better work than slaves. And during the Revolutionary War, a man named Francis Marion thought the same thing. He would only hire free workers, even free blacks, because he said free people worked better than slaves worked. Abraham Lincoln often referred to his fact he'd grown up in poverty. By 1860, his wealth placed him at the top 5% of the nation. But while he rose up the social ladder, a lot of people remained poor. Now, I want to say about Abraham Lincoln, the upper class never did recognize him as one of theirs. To be upper class, you had to be born in it. Now, his sons were recognized as upper class. In other words, because his sons were born into wealth and into a high position. But he himself never was, because he had humble beginnings. This, folk, is a fact that's been true all down through the ages. Even people who became kings, unless their father was a king, they got noticeably less respect than men whose fathers were kings. It was expected if your father was a king, you were more qualified to be a king than you were if your father were not a king. Crop failure, sickness, bad debts could wipe out wealth fast. And about sickness, folk, in those days, a person would get sick and remain sick for maybe 2 or 3 years before they were gradually nursed to health. Antibiotics did not exist. And the cures that we now know were not there. Their doctors did not have much near the knowledge that we do. Now, most people, when they start out young, by the time they get to 65, will experience an illness at some point in their life that will keep them out of work for several months. Most of us. I never did. But that doesn't mean it won't happen to me also. But Most people get an illness at some point in their life that takes them out of work for a long time. My dad did. All right. Between 1840 and 1860, almost 4.5 million immigrants came to the United States. One of them was my great-great-grandfather, John Cunningham. That's another story. He came from Scotland. Most of the immigrants came from Germany or Ireland. The Irish usually were looked down on. The Irish are at the bottom of the social ladder. What about the Irish over here was the potato famine. Now, folk, here was the problem. A man bought one potato into Ireland. And if you know anything how potatoes, bananas, blackberries reproduce, they just simply reproduce by growing out. Every potato in Ireland had one weakness: is susceptible to a strain of virus that would kill it. So when the potato famine hit, it destroyed every potato in Ireland. The Irish people were only growing one crop, mostly potatoes. Well, a lot of them, as they starved, rather than starve, they came to the United States. Signs were put upon factories: Irish need not apply. And the Irish had two problems. Number one, they were mostly Catholic. Again, folk, this is simply a fact. They were mostly Catholic. And no, I do not agree with that at all, but nevertheless, it's a fact. And also, they drank a lot. Again, this is simply a fact. And even I talked to an Irishman one time who is an alcoholic, and now a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, who said that the problem with Ireland was they drank too much and couldn't stop it. But anyway, Irish were white people who were just as much discriminated against as blacks. They were the last ones hired when a factory needed work. They were the first ones to be fired when a factory no longer needed them. Well, there was a prevailing view that whites and men needed to be in charge, and this was something that women's rights advocates had to try to overcome. Transcendentalism. If you study literature, you'll run into this transcendentalism. Essentially, transcendentalists believe that people should look within themselves for their own guidance, that the truth resided inside everyone, and we'd find it by looking in ourselves. Now, folk, every time I say that, I feel like I need to wash my mouth out with soap. There's some things I just don't believe, but nevertheless, they believed it. So, no, I won't wash my mouth out right now. But nevertheless, the truth they believed lay within, and you could find it by searching within. Ralph Waldo Emerson, a poet, Thoreau and Margaret Fuller were some of the transcendentalists. David Thoreau said, "He who would be a man must be a nonconformist. He lived alone." Some of them, though, began to organize in communes or communities. Brock Farm was a haven for those of literary pursuits. But a famous writer once went to Brock Farm and took up residence. He said, I thought I was here to write. But instead I get here and I find out that there's no time to write. I've got to be too busy either slopping the hogs or killing a calf or a cow or something like that. There's just no time to write because of all the work they put on me, so he left. The communes did not work for the most part. Charles Fourier founded a commune where that nobody owned anything. But if you wanted to get a pair of clothes, you look in a clothes closet and pick out, well, hey, I'd like to wear this today, and wear this, and wear whatever was available, whatever somebody who had gotten up a little bit earlier than you hadn't picked. And but again, you did not own the clothes you wore, and the other person didn't own the clothes he wore. And if you wanted to cut the grass, you could pick up any sickle that was available and cut grass with it. And if you wanted to, if it was your turn to wash windows, pick up any sponge that was available. You did not own your own stuff. These communes seldom survived more than 2 or 3 years. One of them practiced free sex. That one lasted a while longer. The Oneida community, founded by John Humphrey Noyes. Churches, the women outnumbered the men more than 2 to 1. A lot of women wanted to preach peace, temperance, and the word temperance here means no drinking and anti-slavery. They began to ask for women to have the right to vote. That's what women's suffrage means. Women right to vote, but no state at this time was about to do that. The country just wasn't ready for that yet. Now, I want to say this about the communes. When I was a little bit older than most of you are now, so two women who I was commuting with between Cleveland and Spring Place, Georgia, joined a commune. And basically it was a commune that consisted of 5 unmarried men, 5 unmarried women, and 1 married couple. The married man was in charge. And here's the way they discussed it. The one woman I commuted with said, it's like being crucified. She said, the man in charge, he's fair, but when it's my turn to do the dishes, it's like I have to. Now see, if she had been living by herself, if she didn't want to do the dishes, she'd just leave them in the sink and do them when she got ready to. When you're living by yourself, if you don't want to wash the windows, well, hey, you don't have to today. You'll eventually get around, you'll do it. But when you live in a commune, when it's your turn to wash the windows, you have to get up and wash the windows whether you feel like it or not, whether you want to or not. You have to wash the dishes when it's your turn, whether you feel like it or not. So, but anyway, all this was bothersome because there was always an unending amount of work to do. Vacuuming, mowing, window washing, whatever, clothes washing, just an unlimited amount of work to do. And no matter how the director divvied it out, it still created a lot of friction. But the real thing that created the friction among the women, one of those 5 unmarried women was a little bit more attractive than the other 4. And all of the unmarried men gave her most of the attention, and the rest of them became extremely jealous. Make a long story short, the women left one at a time. And after a while, the whole commune. These communes were part of a movement called the Children of God. If you look it up, you'll find that there was a whole lot of this going on in the country at the time. And I had a pupil who claimed that her parents were members of the Children of God. But anyway, Americans began pushing west of the Mississippi River. The problem was Great Britain claimed this area here. Now, Great Britain claimed what is today Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. They also claimed what is today Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and British Columbia. So the United States and Great Britain were involved in a dispute over this territory. They wound up settling the dispute by splitting it in half, with Great Britain getting half and the United States getting the other half. But anyway, a lot of persons wanted to move into this territory, and they went up a trail called the Oregon Trail. The Oregon Trail was started in Independence, Missouri. Now, folk, I've got to ask you this. There was a computer game out many years ago, the Oregon Trail game, and it kept improving. How many of you played the Oregon Trail game? Okay, not as many hands go up as once would. Yes, I played it with my daughters, and they eventually played it, and then they got more and more CDs got involved in DVDs, and sometimes they'd get all washed away by the Snake River. I learned to avoid the Snake River because you were completely out of control, even though it was going to get you there faster. Some of you might know what I'm talking about. But anyway, more and more Americans began to go to Oregon. Then the Oregon Trail would split off and go to California, and a lot of persons took the California Trail to get to California. The United States had expanded the Pacific Ocean by the end of the 1840s. Again, conquering that area west of the Mississippi was a long process. The term manifest destiny, and many Americans believed that God had ordained the United States should spread across the continent. They said, after all, wasn't American culture superior to anything? This was their view. John L. O'Sullivan, don't worry about that name O'Sullivan, but do worry about the name Manifest Destiny. It will, I promise you, for some of you, we'll see it on the test. But Manifest Destiny means it's God ordained that we are to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific. An old limerick. The manifest destiny, not a boast, meant we would expand from coast to coast. The land hunger, economics motivated the Western movement. And some people wanted to use California and Oregon, Washington place to trade with the Far East. Well, to do this, the United States would need Pacific ports, which we eventually got. Mountain men, the mountain men oftentimes dressed in furs, and they would go and set up traps and trap animals. The most famous one was Jedediah Smith. But they explored the Oregon Territory. Missionaries went there and sent back reports about how beautiful the territory was. Settlers began to move in. Also, the Plains Indians, they were fierce fighters, and they had horses that they'd managed to acquire from the Spanish. You may know horses are one of the few animals that can even be caught as an adult and tamed as an adult. The Indians learned to catch horses that had gotten away from the Spaniards, and they would, the Indians became excellent horsemen, even though the Indians very seldom rode with a saddle. They rode mostly bareback, and maybe that made their horses a little bit faster than the white man's horses. I don't know. There are advantages to riding in a saddle. Bareback, it's more easy for them to throw you, for the horse to throw you off if he wants to. Buffalo. There were 15 million buffalo in 1800 estimated. By 1890, there were only 600 left, and people began to pass severe laws to restrict the killing. Buffaloes, hunters would often kill them merely for fun and not even bother to get their hides or eat them. Mormons, and then I'll close. Well, actually, I've got to close now. It's time. Now, folk, I want to remind you, these lectures are online, and you'll see this morning's class because I've